Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the War Report. Now, this episode, I wouldn't say is going to be a little different, but it's going to be a little all over the place given the subject matter we have to cover. And the main news out of this week has been, at the same time, both domestic while covering world events, but all the talk has been, at least from what I've seen, and that would be relevant to this show, is the talk of troop withdrawals, whether that be from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Somalia was even tossed around there, but just the general downgrading of U.S. military presence abroad. Now, the news came out after, of course, Secretary of Defense Esper got fired, and a lot of high ranking Pentagon officials were dismissed over the past week and a half. And a lot of other people were hired onto Pentagon jobs, including one Colonel Douglas McGregor, who has been a very heavy critic of current American involvement and very skeptical of current American foreign policy. He was in consideration for both the position of National Security Advisor and Ambassador to Germany previously. And of course, his claim to fame is he was one of the main commanders during the first Gulf War at the Battle of 73 Easting, which is one of the largest tank battles since the end of World War II. So he just got hired onto a Pentagon job, and people are speculating that means there's going to be a withdrawal. Now, I don't think that's concrete, but considering the fact a lot of the top brass in the Pentagon has been gutted, we haven't seen similar moves in the intelligence agencies such as the FBI or CIA, and a lot of people have criticisms of the current FBI director, Christopher Wray, so I wouldn't be surprised within the next few weeks we see that come out. Trump just go scorched earth on the military and intelligence establishment because that seems like the direction he's going in. I'm not really sure what to make of it. Now, the current proposal for a withdrawal from Afghanistan, which we saw earlier this year, we saw at the end of 2018, would be to withdraw the vast majority of troops except a residual force that would act sort of as an advisory and a basic protection for the Afghan government. And again, that would be official numbers. Of course, the numbers of mercenaries, they'd still be crawling all over the country. But even if we were to reduce just to a few hundred, I mean, that would still be a presence there. But even just that, I do think the overarching theme of what I see out of all these talks with Iraq, which, to mention, we'll get into it later, but apparently the U.S. Embassy in Iraq was conveniently attacked again hours after these announcements. Make of that what you will. But what I'm seeing is you're seeing these theaters, such as Afghanistan, which we've sunk 19, almost 20 years into, Iraq, which we've sunk, let's see, '03, about 17 years, so again, almost 20 as well. Somalia, which we've also been in since the '90s on and off. Just all these different theaters. Syria, which we've been in for about a decade at this point, maybe just shy of. That they're willing to make all these concessions, and that while I do wholeheartedly support getting out of all of these theaters, all of them, it still shows the fact that they're willing to concede that if they are, that's the big if, that troubled times are probably ahead, if we're being honest, if they are willing to sacrifice some of these big imperial strongholds they put so much into over the past several decades. Because, sure, we've been at war in Afghanistan since 2001, but we've been involved there since before the Soviet invasion. That was throughout the late 1970s was a battle for influence. The Soviets eventually won up the Americans by actually invading the country. We won up them by actually funding opposition groups. Of course, that leads to the Taliban taking over the country, Bin Laden, etc. You know the story from there. So, something we have sunk 40 years, almost, yeah, 40 years, we've been 79, so just over 40 years into the fact that we're talking about picking up and leaving. Now, again, it wouldn't be a complete abandonment. I'm sure the CIA is still probably crawling over the country. Mercenaries would be. But just the fact that it's being seriously considered at this point, I think, is very telling of the direction things are going, not only abroad, but you could also say at home, which we'll get into with some of the election stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's if it weren't for America, a lot of little girls in Afghanistan wouldn't be reading. So
Oh no,
there's
how
that.
else will they be able to watch Netflix and get office jobs? It's just, oh no, it's horrible. I'm so it was totally worth $6 trillion and 4,000 troops totally.
Yeah, sorry to get old Dan Crenshaw on this, but yeah, that's sort of the excuse making uh, that's supposed to appear to the normie cons, as to why maybe we should stay another 20 years. And I mean, if you actually read any of those threads, you can see it's a wildly unpopular stance to take, and nobody really cares. Like at one time, that position had some cachet. Uh, I remember even before 9/11 or thereabouts, there were calls actually to do something about Afghanistan because there was this civil war going on in Afghanistan, and it involved the Mujahideen, and the Mujahideen was against the Taliban, and then Al Qaeda was thrown in. So there were these disagreements, and the war never stopped there. But and there was so there were arguments about how we were going to bring uh, liberal democratic values and equality for women.
Yeah, women can drive in Afghanistan now. I remember, well, I don't remember like firsthand, but I remember just going back through the history of the American involvement in Afghanistan. That was one of the big things the media made a big deal about after we overthrew the Taliban government.
Right, right. It's always interesting when you hear that kind of messaging being applied. Uh, Generally, it does seem to be the preamble to something else that usually involves a heating up of the situation or conflict in that area. It's just funny to me now in hindsight. I mean, it hasn't happened with Iran, but it goes through similar processes. Like the so-called green wave or the green movement that was kind of popular about 3 years ago or so.
Yeah, and then the thought uprising about 2 3 years ago. I remember that. Yeah, they go through that, of course, to drum up support from the liberal establishment in the West. Give us money, give us guns, definitely, Mr. CIA man. We support you and we support Western values. Sort of like how throughout the 70s and 80s, you had all these uh, Latin American and Asian groups calling themselves communists just to get like Soviet and Chinese aid. It's a similar concept, I would say, but you see all these things coming together, and again, very few arguments for staying there. People who usually suggest it, like you're saying, Crenshaw, who's a politician, they don't receive very positive feedback on those talking points because a lot of people, even if it is like that, they are fed up with it. One of the other ones, of course, they were talking about is like, well, if we pull out now, what's to say they won't plot another 9/11 or another major terrorist attack when you look at the state of Afghanistan from '01 to 2020. In '01, it was ruled by one group of Sunni Muslim warlords. Now it's ruled by multiple Sunni Muslim warlords, and the Taliban controls about half the country. But my point being is the the wherewithal to actually have a continued, even light level occupation of Afghanistan among the American people is near zero, if not outright completely gone, because nobody cares. It's again, it hasn't even been a costly war compared to the likes of I don't know something like Vietnam. Not even to get into the world wars and other conflicts that we've been involved in throughout our country history. But in terms of living memory, like I'd say like something like Vietnam, but it hasn't even been like to those levels. The casualties have been relatively low, all things considered. I mean, now the amount of money we've dumped into it has not been, but the point is, American people are tired of hearing about there being troops in Afghanistan. They want just it to end. Nobody knows why we're there. At least nobody knows the official reason why we're there. Of course, the
Right.
official regions has oscillated. We have to find Bin Laden. We have to stabilize the country. We have to secure the current Afghan government. But it's gotten to the point where the people at the top don't even give you a concrete fake answer while we're there. I mean, we know the real reasons. We know it's the opium trade. We know it's Russia, China, and Iran being that pivotal point in
Yeah.
between all of them. But of course, they're not going to outright say that. But they're not even giving like good excuses anymore. And I think that's where they've really lost the American public. That plus almost 2 decades.
Well, I mean, the messaging on the public level does bear some resemblance, as you mentioned, to Vietnam. America being basically a messianic country in that regard, where, the message of female equality and females reading and being active in public life is of utmost importance. That is running dry. It can be reactivated, and in many ways, Trump pulling out was a kind of subtle signaling that of his misogyny. Essentially, it was I guess it was a complex way of signaling that, and ultimately what they had to do is lie that bounties were being placed on American soldiers in Afghanistan vis-a-vis the Russians, right? But I suppose staying there in a way uh, kind of demonstrates American power and demonstrates to what its messianic role is in the world. And as you say, people are running out of patience, and really the main reason they are, it has been nearly 20 years. Um, you have stories of father and son both serving in Afghanistan, and there's been virtually nothing to show for
Yeah,
it.
and we're almost 10 years out from the at least official story of the bin Laden assassination that happened in 2011. So, that was the main thing, again, for the first decade of the war. We got to find the guy who did 9/11. And then all of a sudden we
Right.
get him, nothing really changes. Then we have to try all these people involved in 9/11 to the point where at in January, which is like 2 months from now, we're actually going to be beginning another trial for a plotter of 9/11. That's how long this has gone on. It'll be 20 years at that point, and we found so many people connected to this, which again leads me down a more conspiratorial road I won't get into, at least for now, that we're still trying people in 2021 for a terrorist attack that took place in 2001.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost as if a large segment of the American population doesn't see that America, is an empire, and it doesn't see why, even after assassinating Bin Laden, why they should remain in Afghanistan, right? Um, I would say that in many ways, the Trump administration kind of solidified a process that was already happening under Obama, where basically you have, and under Biden, it will be kind of solidified, so it'll be interesting to watch, and that is the shift from American foreign policy uh, being basically about exporting um, liberal values, but in a way that's not tied with any kind of vague notions about, I would say, mm, Christianity for one. So Obama kind of made it okay to be a Democrat and do regime change, partly because of Democrat strategies to maintain the White House, and that goes right down to its polity and its electorate. Where they uh, will remain quiet when he's bombing, but not so when Bush is. Um, and there's so with Trump in office, in a way, that last stage was kind of realized because you saw repeatedly that Democrats were more in favor of being involved in Syria than Republicans were, and more involved in remaining in Afghanistan than Republicans or self-identified conservatives were. So that's a really interesting development that we've actually talked about on this show. Kind of like the inner party is now aligning with the permanent seat of power in America in a much more explicit way than before. It's kind of like the outer party, which is of course the Republican Party, doesn't have any built-in messaging of its own that they could export vis-a-vis military power to the rest of the world, right? Yeah, some vague ideas about democracy and elections and all that, yes. But today, Charlie Kirk just let everybody know with a big boom that Botswana has now legalized homosexuality, right?
Oh,
So
that good old
even the
one. That
top,
was like, I remember because that was last summer, and because it was a few months after Trump announced his Rainbow Crusade, and yeah, people are bringing that one back up, and oh boy, that we went over that extensively on the earlier episodes. You want to check out about a year and a half ago.
right? So in many ways, the Republican Party is doing the work, uh, running the narrative that the Democrat Party would like to do when it comes to foreign intervention. And you so what does the Republican Party have really left to offer? These two parties were usually more easily distinguished from one another in terms of their foreign policy, but they're not now. And so this amazing change has happened. And I would say, despite all that, that if this really does stick, that if Trump really does manage to remove troops from Iraq and Afghanistan, I would think that the Biden administration will find a way to put them back in, and it will have a consensus in order to do that. Uh, Republicans on the ground, your everyday Republicans, not the politicians, are kind of ironically are becoming kind of like representatives of the working class, and also um, you know the peaceniks, if you will, of American politics right now. So that'll be a position that they can adopt. Um, it's not a bad position per se, right? Because again, the success is not there. It has not shown itself. It's proven to be, a very bad strategy. It's empowered Iran, and there is no success to really speak of. So I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball exactly what's going to happen under Biden, but I would presume that, you know, let's at least first wait and see if Trump is able to accomplish this. And if he is, my guess is that Biden will find a way to put them back in.
Well, just to put a little more perspective on that in terms of who is really the face of the empire now. Nowadays, it's the Democrats. It's people like Biden. It's people like Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama. But of course, you go back 20, 30 years ago, it was people like the Bushes. It was people like John McCain. Fundamentally, I do think, to tie everything together, it also does go back to that demographic change because up until relatively recently, it still was the WASP's country. It was the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants country. It was, to put it in more broad terms, the white man country. So they were the dominant ones. They dominated politics. Now, of course, you can point to a certain group that was always behind them and always in alliance with them. They usually marry their children. Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump is a good example. And without getting too explicit, both of Bush Jr.'s daughters married two people of these certain ethno-religious group. But again, I think you all know what I'm talking about at this point. But it was fundamentally that. It was an old guard. And it goes back to, of course, the World Wars era, specifically after World War II, where the American Empire really became the inheritor of the British Empire, and these people viewed themselves, of course, as the descendants of the English. It was their torch to bear now. It was the hands of the Anglosphere. The responsibility of the Anglosphere was in their hands now. But now that America has become diverse and multicultural and has to be this pluralistic democracy where our ethnicity doesn't matter, our racial group doesn't matter, we can all link arms together. So as long as you're not a white guy, that is why the Democrats are, of course, the face of the empire now because that's been their platform for the past few decades and more explicitly so throughout the 2010s. So really, it was never like the empire would represent sort of who was the dominant political force at home, and perhaps this speaks more so to me just because of my personal circumstance, but it was never the country of the white ethnic, was it? It was never a country of the the Irishmans, the Italians, the Poles, the Germans. It was never for me and my ilk. But again, personal self pity aside, I think again what it boils down to is like yeah, we've seen a shift on what happens domestically affects how we project ourselves outside of our borders. Which again, we've gone over this with Iran and why war with Iran is less likely, and why support for Israel isn't as much as it maybe was, for example, in the 2000s, right after 9/11. And the second point I'll make about that is if Trump does get the troops out, as you were saying, and Biden still does pull off a victory, you know who his Secretary of State is probably going to be?
Uh, I don't know.
Susan Rice is probably that's the name
Oh
thrown
wow,
around.
yeah, that's right. That's right.
And you have to remember, Susan Rice is the humanitarian interventionist who could probably come up with an excuse to intervene anywhere across the world for any so-called human rights reason, and she would be all for it. Libya, the freedom fighters in Libya were her idea. The freedom fighters in Syria were her idea. Not to even to mention the whole debacle with Benghazi, which again, that's some
Hmm.
valid criticisms there, but I don't think it will affect her appointment through the Senate. Some people speculate that, but point being is you'll have probably one of the biggest hawks up there with people like maybe she's less explicit about it. Maybe she uses different language and terms to get her points across. People like Bolton, people like Pompeo, who we'll get into in a second. But I mean that would be the Biden administration, and if you believe the rumors that Dick Cheney would have a foreign policy advisory role, oh boy, you're in for a good time then. But yeah, that's all. That's all I had to say about that particular instance before getting onto some of the other stuff.
Yeah, like there, I don't see. I mean, I think with Trump, what we're seeing is the first kind of fraying at the edges of the American geopolitical power. From what we gathered, if you can trust the information from the Hunter Biden laptop, then but it's kind of like what everybody sort of suspected from the Biden, Clinton, and Obama crew that essentially for the money, America got out of the way of China, and so that is still going on. In the South Seas, that's another area where uh, China is essentially uncontested, and I don't think they're going to be contested with Biden in office.
Oh, you,
And
you,
then
you
you
don't you
have
don't think the glorious Japanese Empire will rise again?
no, especially when you consider the new trade deal that's been signed with 14 other countries, well, 13, 14 altogether, if you include China. And South Korea and Japan are part of this economic union.
So is this just the TPP 2.0 that they created because the last one fell apart?
Uh, it could be, but America's not part of it. And, even Australia is part of it. So,
Wow.
in a way, it's like this other this other third way has been found from the friction between uh, Trump and Xi Jinping. So, um, yeah, I mean, basically, it, how can I put it? There's all sorts of reasons why America's probably still in Afghanistan. Like you say, the opium trade is one of them, and that was useful in the 80s and 90s in order to ship the opium to Russia in order to weaken its populace there. But um, that's not really an effective policy anymore. Um, the drugs are ending up, basically more in Europe,
Yeah, especially now
and
that fentanyl has hit the streets, it's sort of push opium heroin to the side.
right. And so it's a kind of a dying policy that has um, some kind of nefarious institutions that are wrapped up in it that it's going to be hard to justify them. And then there is, of course, the symbolic sense of defeat if America removes itself from these areas. if anything, I would see America prioritizing Eastern Europe over anything else at the moment. But I would not suspect that the Middle East is going to be an area that's going to be abandoned anytime soon. Um, no matter how, let's say, no matter how energy independent America is, its need for the world to continue to trade oil in American dollars is still important. But again, people are other countries are chipping away at this, and the recent um, Asian Pacific deal that was signed recently, all those exchanges will happen in each country's currency and the yuan. So they're not going to do it in American dollars.
Yeah, not to mention that Saudi Arabia is also starting to sell oil in yuan. So they're,
Yes.
if anything, especially under somebody like Biden or maybe less of an anti-establishment candidate like Trump. I'm not saying that Trump has been like fighting the system and draining the swamp and that Q is right, but he's been something of an obstacle, if you will. But once
Yes.
things quote unquote return to normal, if they do, there's going to be a doubling down in the Middle East that the energy trade still has to be conducted in the American dollar. Not to mention, of course, the Israeli interests with Syria and increasingly the West Bank and the Iran issue. So it's going to be a twofold, uh, perhaps a quadrupling down if you consider it a twofold doubling down on policy in the Middle East. And with that being said, I guess we'll get into some of the serious stuff with Pompeo and the recent moves there. So I'm going to pull up our little chart here, our little map. Now, the main news has been there have been Israeli strikes on Syrian and Syrian allied forces such as Iranian backed militias and I believe even Iranian forces proper in Syria yet again. And this is all near the Golan Heights, near the Israeli border, near Lebanon, so more so in southern Israel. It seems like Aleppo has been abandoned by pretty not Aleppo. I Aleppo, Idlib, that area of northwestern Syria
Hmm.
has been abandoned by pretty much everyone. They've sort of accepted its fate. And it looks like that the main push again is, of course, in southern Syria currently with the Iranian-backed forces. And judging by the previous standard we've gone off of, which again has some basis in reality, but also is massive speculation, that the more active Israel is in Syria with their own military, the more dissatisfied they are with policy in Washington. And considering the past month, even before the election, how inwardly focused everyone was in American politics, even the president himself, Israel probably wasn't happy with the lack of focus on Syria. Even though they're not going to strike targets in northwestern Syria, they probably aren't too happy about Idlib falling. And, Turkey's also been getting out of that, and we'll see how that plays out. But I do feel, especially with Netanyahu's moves, with one could say his endorsement of Biden becoming president, if you will, with his one tweet, however much you want to read into that, that the Israeli establishment is deeply upset with Washington's inaction in Syria as of late.
Right, and this also comes on the heels of a recent road that has been open. It has been closed for near 30 years between Iraq and Saudi Arabia. And one of the stated purposes is to facilitate trade with Syria. Um, Saudi Arabia lifted a bunch of sanctions that it had placed on Syria with regards to trade last year. So this is part of that agreement, if you will. It was actually marked off as a significant play, a significant development in Middle Eastern politics. So not a big story here, but a bigger story there. Um, in a way, that's kind of been par for the course these 4 years with the Trump administration, as he's to highlight and add on to what you were saying about Israel's disappointment with America with regards to Syria, is that Syria is, despite all the hardships and all the recent sanctions that have been placed on it from America and Western Europe in order to essentially starve out the populace, as a kind of a last ditch effort to oust Assad. It's not. It's still plugging along. It's still, other regional players are still willing. These are the same players like Saudi Arabia who were funding um, ISIS and Al Qaeda in Syria. Uh, through various covert channels, but we know from the WikiLeaks emails that is what they were doing, and the Obama administration was well aware of it. Um, so there has been a significant turnaround, and I think Netanyahu doesn't realize, like, Syria is the way America is going to handle Syria is playing a very, very long game. It's not going to rectify the situation in an immediate way. There's not going to be an Iraq-style invasion, and that's its frustration, basically.
Yeah, and you could even argue under Biden that would be a more frustrating relationship because Trump has been inactive in Syria, but whenever he takes actions, it's usually something akin to what Israel requested, such as the two strikes, such as the sanctions, etc. But Biden would have to juggle, of course, between Turkish interest, not to isolate them, Kurdish interest, uh, any reconciliation he would try with the Iranians, trying to revive the Iran deal in any form, and of course Israel. So he would be less likely to take Israeli interests seriously, especially under a Likud government, which again is still in power. Netanyahu still is in power. How long that will be, I don't know. Could be for the next 5 years, could be for the next 10 years. He could get voted out in a snap election tomorrow, for all I know. The political situation, at least electorally in Israel, is not as stable as you would think, but you have that. And then on top of that, just to show the way things are going, is Pompeo's visit concluded by him taking a visit to the Israeli occupied Golan Heights and standing on the plateau and staring over into Syria. So, what you had with that is, of course, we already recognize the annexation, but it has gotten to the point where this is like one last affirmation that, hey, it's really yours, and we fully recognize that point where we're willing to send our probably, second to top diplomat, if you consider the president the top diplomat, to this area. I mean, who knows? Maybe Trump will spend his second to last day in office, January 19th, take a visit to the Golan Heights right before he passes the baton over to Biden. Who knows? Or maybe that will be Biden's first state visit. I don't know, but point being is, although it doesn't mean much in any absolute terms, any concrete terms, of course it's very symbolic. The recognition of it being annexed by Israel proper, by the United States, is symbolic. The recognition of all these things, of course, Pompeo also visits settlements in the West Bank. So, pretty much solidifying that if Trump gets a second term, that they will be fully committed to Israel. And that brings me into my next point, which is a lot of the speculation. Now, of course, election day is already passed, and we're about 2 weeks out from that, and we still have no clear result. The Electoral College convenes in about a month. There has been calls for recounts. There's been all kinds of news and scandals coming out about alleged, fraud here and miscounting there, and the Dominion voting machines, which have also been a topic of controversy. Which again seems like the case for Trump looks more and more optimistic every day. It seems like, I mean, he's closed the gap significantly, not entirely, in places like Georgia and Arizona and even Michigan. Michigan's also been a big one that surprised me. I figured out of all the states, if he would have lost any legitimately, Michigan probably would have been one of them, but apparently not. So, I'm not saying he has it entirely, but it's looking more and more promising for him. But you have all of that, and the big speculation is if Trump loses, will he give a farewell strike to Iran on behalf of Netanyahu? That's been the big topic of speculations come from within the Pentagon. Allegedly, it's come from all over the media. People have been talking about it a lot, and I think there's a pretty good case for and against it. Now, one could say the current troop withdrawals are to prepare for something bigger with Iran, which, again, fair case, but I don't see why you remove them from such strategic positions as Afghanistan and Iraq if you're going to do that. I mean, I could see Syria, I could see Somalia, but those two in particular, I don't know, just it doesn't strike me as it makes sense to give up those two before pushing into Iran proper when that seems to have been the strategy to build this ring around them. But that aside is, I can definitely see the case for it that, of course, Trump has done a lot. He needs to ingratiate himself one last time with the establishment, maybe for a sort of Yeltsin, I shut up but you don't prosecute me sort of deal. And there's that. There's that he may deliver on that one final promise to the establishment, to the Israeli establishment, etc. But it also doesn't add up again with the troop withdrawals, with some of the other things. To the point where if he genuinely just wanted to strike Iran, I think he would have probably done it by now. Probably post election day would have been the time he did it. Maybe he's waiting for over the holidays when the media is more distracted and people are paying less attention to the news to do it then. There's also that, but I don't know.
I,
We've
yeah.
seen this sort of headline before. We've seen John Bolton be dismissed by Trump, but if you had to make me pick, if you had to make me take a solid guess, I'd say it's probably not going to happen. But again, I wouldn't be surprised at the end of the day if that's the last thing Trump leaves us with. But I just have a hard time believing it.
Yeah, I have a very hard time believing it because if we recall last summer, it seemed as if, this is before, of course, the about 6 months prior, before the assassination of Soleimani, when things were getting really hot in the Persian Gulf. It was actually Trump's decision not to escalate things, and he bragged about that. You know, um, so I don't see why that would change now. Um, I think despite how unhappy Netanyahu is with the way Trump handled foreign policy, I don't think he's going to get what he wants. I think he got some symbolic things done. Some of them more symbolic, some of them less. Like you could argue, moving the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. Uh, Mostly some symbolic, but it has consequences. The other would be the Golan Heights. Those were areas that, quite honestly, Syria has lost control of those areas for nearly half a decade, for at least a half a decade now. So, it's stating the obvious. What Netanyahu really wanted was essentially more American troops in Syria, the disposement of Assad, and many critical strikes on Iran, nothing short of causing a revolution in Iran in order to uninstall the Ayatollahs. And that didn't happen. And there's very little reason, I think, to think that that's going to happen with Biden. Short of some gayop, I don't think we're going to see that. Um, People will kind of interpret this. People on the left will interpret it as an act of impotence, and ultimately a kind of geopolitical cuckoldry, because Trump unfollowed Netanyahu the moment that Netanyahu praised Biden's victory. And it will demoralize, not that Trump isn't capable of doing something stupid like that, but it will demoralize whatever is left of his base. And I would stress that the GOP is interested in keeping alive some kind of watered down MAGA movement, within its ranks
Oh,
in order
I
to
mean, you've
stay
seen the
viable
shamelessly
for the next four
rebranding
years.
since 2017 to the point where even somebody like Marco Rubio is trying to say we need a multi-ethnic, multicultural working class movement, and that you know what, maybe we were wrong about the dogmatic economic policy we took for. I mean, you're already seeing them like now. I don't believe for a
Yeah,
minute any of it's genuine, but they're already starting to adopt some Trumpian rhetoric in order to keep this base that Trump brought in the way he's reformed the GOP. So while they may be hawkish, why they may want these regime change, is they have to be a bit more sly about them now. They have to be a bit more subtle about them now.
right. And some people have probably rightly theorized that one of the reasons Biden was chosen as VP during the Obama years was, to basically keep tabs on him. So, Obama didn't do it. Biden couldn't convince him one way or the other if Obama was going to do it, and he was sure as hell not going to do it. Um, and ultimately, Trump had the opportunity to do it. The scale of the problems, America bombed other countries for far less than what was happening in the Persian Gulf in 2019. You have the situation with American sailors basically crying, being interrogated by the Iranians. You have those strikes in Saudi Arabia. You have all these ships pestering trade and pestering American military ships in the Persian Gulf. I guess we're also running out of mileage about bombing countries for less as well. It's easy for me to say you bombed countries for far less. Well, the problem is everybody's still living with the consequences of that, and people aren't happy about it. So uh, I don't see Trump actually doing this. Like you, I don't completely count it out, but I don't see it because he's already been betrayed by Netanyahu, and there's nothing Netanyahu can do for him right now in terms of the election and the election results. I don't know how much ass kissing he really wants to do at this point, because any more that he does is just going to tarnish his image for all the people who still support him. Like, the fact of the matter is, his base right now doesn't care ultimately about Iran. They ultimately don't care about Israel. Ultimately, it is about the initial messaging that he put out in 2016 about America first, and that is still largely loose and general, but it does not include the kind of American foreign policy that we've seen from the late 90s up until now. It doesn't. It's just not in it. And for him to do that will just make it will hollow them out. Like, I mean, it's going to be difficult for them once Biden is sworn in, right? And it's up to Trump if he wants to leave a legacy weaker, than it already is. Like, they're how can I put it? They're activated because Biden won, right? They're not activated because they're infuriated with Iran. That's all this comes down to. Like, his base has basically largely ignored his missteps geopolitically, like assassinating Soleimani. Well, except for maybe for Nick Fuentes, but um, and even then, that was kind of sort of half-hearted. He was just angry that people were attacking Trump for it rather
Yeah,
than
yeah. That's been the
Soleimani
thing about
himself.
Trump's foreign policy. Whereas a lot of people where there's reason why this show is so obscure, among other factors, but the fact that most people don't like to think about foreign policy and geopolitics because we're weird in the regard that it strikes our interest. I'll say that most people, when they think about politics, they think about what's happening, on the ground in their hometown, in their country, whatever. They like to think about what did the Democrats say, what did the Republicans say. Did you see the debate last night? They don't. typically most people, and I frankly don't blame them, don't like to look and see like, oh hey, what's going on with Syria or Afghanistan or some election over in Europe or Asia. So again, a lot of them will just like take Trump at his word, like, oh we're not going to get into the war, but we're going to show the world that we're strong and tough. But again, that's not the main selling point. Yeah, they'll be like, okay, cool, Trump has got our best interest at heart if he strikes some Iranian general or drops some bombs on a Syrian airbase. They don't think about it much beyond that because it's not like a main Trump issue. It's not somebody like George Bush who, at least in his second term campaign, made it where like, oh, America's going to be strong, we have to secure the world, or somebody like Crenshaw who, campaigns on that kind of stuff. But at the end of it, like you said, I think it shows that again, most people really don't think about these issues because they either don't have the time or the interest, or maybe a combination of the two. But I do think if Trump does strike Iran, or if he doesn't strike Iran, this will ultimately tell us how much of a ploy it was and how genuine Trump was. Because if Trump was really the puppet, really was just there for the appeasement, for the grand political strategy, of course he's going to strike Iran because, the establishment does want more conflict with Iran. And they also do want to demoralize the Trump movement, the Trump base, and sort of the group that, in their eyes, help derail the Republican Party. So if Trump does that as a middle finger to his base, that's proof that, yeah, maybe Trump was just all fake from the beginning, that he was never serious about it. But if he doesn't, there's at least the thought that maybe he was serious about at least some of it and was just either incompetent or had his hands tied.
Right. I mean, a lot of his base really is about making the libs mad. Like a lot of it is, and a lot of it is quite justified because they see a cultural war happening in the U.S. that's more important. Um, I mean, everybody from like people who support Oath Keepers and Proud Boys. Say what you will. Like the truth is, like, people like fighters. People like who show up to fight. like and like, yeah, it doesn't, like, how these groups support Trump to somebody who's looking at it from a overly rationalistic, deterministic point of view doesn't make sense. But it does when you consider that Trump's mere existence seems to be like this lightning rod of support to fight against these other let's say terrible Americans who are destroying what America is all about and so on. Like most Americans are far more preoccupied with what's happening domestically than they are internationally. And like if Trump does this, it will still, even though it's international, it will still be big enough, especially because they already understand his close ties and association with Israel and Netanyahu, that ultimately he'll screw himself. It's not, nobody in his base wants this. Nobody in his base thinks Iran is a danger. And they are fed up. They are more in favor of ending these wars than the Democrats are, if we're going to be really blunt about it. Not that either side is enthusiastic about them, but it is true. And we've sort of been watching, the statistics being rolled out on this, and it does seem to, they do seem to support that idea. So, yeah, him doing surgical strikes on Iran with like literally over a month left in office will achieve nothing. I don't even think the GOP is behind it, frankly.
It
Like,
would also be completely unprecedented, and I mean that in, well, correct me if I'm wrong, but I can't think of a case throughout the entire history of America where a president started war upon leaving office, especially that close. Now, Bush, Iraq was in '03, so that was like a year before, but you want to talk about that? Trump would have started a war with Iran in 2019 again, which wouldn't have been unheard of. But starting it just mere weeks, if not days, before he leaves office, I don't think that's ever been done before.
yeah, I mean, if anything that Trump could get away with, it would be basically some kind of a surgical strike, the sort that was done on Soleimani and his entourage. Somewhere between 5 to 20 people killed, assassinated of an important figure, and so on. That would be it, and he would get like almost zero support.
Yeah,
Like
I would
it
say
would not.
honestly, it'd actually be more likely to be in Syria, if anything. I think, just based on the logic, is maybe a flimsy example that days before Obama left office, he completely let loose on Libya, where he pretty much dropped everything he could on various targets in Libya as just sort of a final show of force. And we were already involved in Libya
Mhm.
at that point. We were already bombing ISIS, etc., Al Qaeda, whatever. But I think Trump would be more likely to do that in a conflict zone we're already involved in, such as Iraq, such as Afghanistan, rather than open up a new front, so to speak. If he were to even do it at all.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's possible. It's just it would be also tiresome.
Yeah, but ultimately, I don't see him doing that, and I think really, if he wants to screw over Biden, what we're seeing happening right now is it's going to be the withdrawals because it's much harder to get out of a conflict zone than it is to get into one. Because
Hmm. Hmm.
because look, if Trump drops a strike on Syria and then Biden comes in with a conciliatory message saying, "Hey, let's talk about the Iran deal again," whatever, there's a chance that that might pull off. But like, if Trump gets out of Afghanistan and Biden says, "I want to do another surge of 20,000 troops or whatever," that's not going to go over well. Nobody's going to support that. So one would be much more detrimental if Trump is thinking purely in ego, purely in terms of one-upping Biden. One makes a lot more sense than the other in that regard.
Hmm.
But with that, I suppose we should go on to sort of the aftermath and the caucuses.
Yeah, several. There's been several stories that have come about after last week, and some of them have been that there was a peace that was offered to Armenia, to Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan, and he refused it. And basically, what that cost him was far more capitulation of territory and land, not to mention Shusha. And in fact, the former head of the military control service of Armenia, I think it's Movses Hakubayan. So basically, he talked about some very big failures. One was Pashinyan, even after only 3 days of the war, refused to send in regulars into the front line. So he only sent in volunteers that were woefully undertrained and unable. Now, adding to that, they did not receive enough equipment to begin with. But then, as that equipment was being depleted, um, resupplying did not occur at the level that was necessary. The other was, although they successfully jammed uh, systems of the Azerbaijanis that were, using basically suicide drones and other sort of artillery, um, or air offensive strategies. The Azerbaijanis figured out a way around this, and it's come to light that Pashinyan invested in a system that was already deemed useless as far even prior to 2018. So in a way, they were lucky that Azerbaijan didn't go whole hog the way it did uh, in 2018 that they did in 2020. And basically, air to air missiles that could have been used on their Su-30s that they had received from the Russians were not. And there's something, I don't quite understand this part, but they're saying that the air-to-air defense missiles, um, they were stopped in Russia or something. It doesn't. I don't know how to make sense of that. because basically this former minister goes on to say that actually Russia did try to help Armenia every step of the way, within reasonable bounds, and lending equipment and advice and so on. So, I don't know if Pashinyan is still somewhere, hiding somewhere in Armenia, but he does seem to have screwed this up. It,
Wait,
like
whoa. You're telling me a politician funded and installed by George Soros didn't do
yeah,
his job properly? Is that what you're trying to tell me here?
yeah.
That that's You're wrong,
Yeah,
okay,
I mean, he
but
was supposed to he was supposed to supply the front lines with like within 40 hours. He didn't do that. There's like this minister, like basically, has mentioned several glaring mistakes on the part of Armenian leadership. He doesn't blame Pashinyan completely. He does mention that the military was at fault as well. Um, but So I don't know.
just seems
So
like
it just says, the Su-30, because of course I think the real turning point of this battle, of this war, was basically the really intelligent use by the Azerbaijanis of their drones. Right now, Russia has been able to counteract similar drones in Syria quite effectively. Um, but again, Hakuban revealed that Armenia didn't use its Su-30 SM warplanes to counter Azerbaijani drones due to a lack of air-to-air missiles. Production and delivery of these missiles were stopped in Russia. Like, is that before the war or during the war? I mean, it looks like there was never even an attempt to use them in the first place. Um, so I don't know. And they used like air defense systems that were like utterly useless. The 9K-33 OSA or OSA,
yeah,
which
I've never even
is
heard of that one. Like, I mean, it was
it
the point
means
where
Hornet.
yeah, they weren't even using S-200s like in Syria.
Yeah, they weren't even at that level.
Yeah,
So, uh,
that would explain a lot.
and of course, the Azerbaijanis used like these old planes that were literally flown like drones. There was no one inside them, and what would happen is that the Armenians would open fire on them, and then the actual drone that would be used to strike. So this was bait. Then that actual drone would be used. That suicide drone would then be used because now it would reveal the positions of the Armenians that were trying to shoot down this old plane.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I
That was
think it goes back to the point where among the Armenian military establishment, of course, political establishment, with Pashinyan being again a Soros puppet, there was a gross mismanagement of the war to the point where you had militiamen fighting a proper military in the in terms of Azerbaijan, and hardened fighters coming from places like Syria and Libya. So the deck was stacked against them, admittedly, but it doesn't seem like among the Armenian leadership, like you said, they never even deployed the military proper. There was even an effort for a victory, and again, that's to be expected of somebody like Pashinyan, who was put there by Soros, who was put there in a color revolution, trying to be pro-Western, and as the West is waging a proxy war in his country, because at the end of the day, that's the only thing you can really call it. Because look, you had Macron condemn it, you had Trump kinda condemn it, but at the end of the day, the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan that just happened was a NATO proxy war against Armenia. And this is after they accept the West's terms and conditions, so to speak, in the form of installing a more quote unquote pro-Western government, a more quote unquote democratic government. And the other big thing is it seems like the takeaway of a lot of people within uh, the media establishment, not only here but abroad, it seems like the main way they go about criticizing this loss is that we lost to dictators like Erdogan and Aliyev rather than realizing that maybe Armenia needed stronger leadership itself. Maybe they wouldn't have fared so poorly if they had a quote unquote dictator in power there. I'm not saying it would have changed the outcome of the war, but I'm saying that their dysfunctional democracy and whatever Frankenstein form of government they have between post-Soviet function and Western quote unquote liberalism, it didn't fare well compared to the strongman rule of Erdogan and Aliyev in Turkey and Azerbaijan respectively. And at the end of the day, there's not really much more you can say than this was a dropping of the ball. It could have been a lot worse. As you're saying, it is a lot worse compared to the peace deal that was offered, but it just doesn't seem like with the kind of leadership they had, there was ever any hope of them winning this war. And I'd hate to say it, but I had a feeling after a few weeks that that's sort of what it looked like. And I think the strategy
Yeah.
from this point forward is the West, NATO, etc. They're going to go into Armenia. They're going to spread these messages that, well, Russia let you down. You can't rely on them. You should become even more pro-Western because we'll support you. We'll uphold your territorial integrity. We'll defend your national sovereignty, etc. And that's exactly what they're going to do with it. You have the West to not only fail to aid them, but actually aided their enemies, particularly in the form of Turkey. Yeah, I mean, and yeah, that's us getting the fact that
Yeah.
Israel, who gets how many billions of dollars a year from the United States alone, how many billions do you think Israel gets from various NATO countries combined? It has to be up there, like it has to be up there with the U.S. aid at least in total. Like, so they probably are getting, they're getting several $billions a year at that in military aid, which again they send to Azerbaijan, which they allegedly stop. So you have all these different Western and Western proxies funding Armenia's enemies, and the case the West is going to make, they haven't made it yet. They've made it to a degree, but not any large scale argument that Russia let you down, so you should side with us. That's where they're going to take this. And
Yeah. Yeah.
unfortunately, I think maybe not all, but I think at least the political establishment there is going to fall for that bait.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this too was about demoralizing Russia as well. Um, but that hasn't really worked out, and I think one of the reasons why the West is so upset by this is because essentially Russia is going to determine the safety of that region. Now, there are some perks because one of those perks is several roads that are going to be used for trade are going to be opened up, and Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Russia are going to be involved in that. So many of these roads were closed for, like, Iran too is part of this, for decades upon decades. Um, some of the territory has been highly altered because Iran actually built a dam there, and that cut off train lines. It's very bizarre when you read about it. But Armenia didn't seem to mind anyhow. So there's going to be work because that's actually um, basically water levels have been greatly reduced since then by in some areas by like 65 meters, which is huge. So not to get too into the weeds in that, but so there is a possibility that this area can be used for trade, and it might be kind of a win-win situation. It's way too early to tell, to be honest. I don't suspect Georgia is going to, Armenia is going to do, uh, some kind of a follow up to this war where they, risk losing everything in order to regain the territory. Uh, it's, let's say, in the next 24 months. I doubt that. If they do, I think it will be quite a few years from now. I would give it at least 4 or 5. So it's difficult to say. It's a huge blow. I think the country is, extremely demoralized from this, and the West is angry because essentially Russia now has like a permanent base. There is another base that's being constructed for, overseeing um, essentially how peacekeeping is going to be done. Turkey is going to have some personnel, but they're not necessarily military. Um, as well, Turkey's not going to have their military vehicles making the rounds kind of in the way that they do with Russia in Syria. So these will be entirely Russian forces. And actually, Aliyev, the president of Armenia, he's the one who requested this. So now he's essentially slapped Erdogan with this. But Aliyev seems like a very, very shrewd man. He does not want to piss off Russia. He sees that, working with Russia, basically that Russia is the better leader in that region than Erdogan or Turkey.
Which are bold words from a Turk himself. I mean, the
Hmm.
Azeris, they're Turkic peoples. That's real pan Turnist hours, I guess, right here going on. But I mean, I'd hate to say it, but again, this war was sort of over before it started. It wasn't too hard to see the direction things were going in after the first few days, after about the first week or two, because it again, just to return to the point that the Armenian political establishment did not conduct this war properly, and everyone, including themselves, are now paying the price for it. Now, again, Pashinyan hasn't been seen in how long because he doesn't want to get lynched like the Speaker of the House did. But if they get if they get his hand, if the Armenians get their hands on him, it's going to be more brutal than Gaddafi. I can tell you that. And
Yeah.
look, I really don't know what Armenia's path going forward is because I do think there will be that push towards westernization now that apparently Russia's failed them or whatever. But I don't know how
Mm.
successful that is going to be. And again, Russia they came out surprisingly well out of this. I expect them to fare worse, having um, at least a marginal Turkish victory on their border. But they're going to have to play it very carefully and really re-solidify their power in that region if they want it to go any further. Because again, they've already all but lost Georgia, Abkhazia and South Ossetia notwithstanding. Armenia, they're at risk of losing. They already had a color revolution there, and again, now they have the campaign of Russia betrayed you going on in Armenia, and Azerbaijan is need I say more? So it's going to be for lack of a better term, a minefield for Russian policy in that region going forward, and then also that has to do with keeping the Turkish influence at bay with their relationship with Iran. So and who knows what troubles the oil-rich Caspian Sea will bring them in the near future.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, like I say, I don't think we're going to see any pipelines. I mean, maybe that'll be happening. Um, who knows? This could be, this could turn into a positive thing. Um, it just might happen. We don't know. Because it's still very, very volatile right now. I mean, and ironically, I would say the biggest wild card yet again is Turkey.
Oh, gee, and
Yeah, it's a bigger wild card for like the next, say, 6 to 12 months about what happens in Nagorno-Karabakh than even Armenia.
yeah, I'd say even at the point than the president of the United States because there will be some influence on whether Biden or Trump is in office on how Turkey behaves, but probably not in that region. No, like in Syria, in Iraq, yeah, there will be, but in the Caucasus, in its relationship with Armenia, and Russia as a whole, and Russia's near abroad in the former Soviet Union, I think no matter who's president, Biden's going to give them a blank check to do whatever they want, and Trump is probably going to show less interest in general. So yeah, again, whatever direction Turkey goes in makes break this. Maybe Erdogan succumbs to a health condition, which is unlikely, or is forced to resign, or gets assassinated, or something. That would be probably the biggest game changer that could happen if Erdogan at any point over the next year is out of office.
Hmm.
But I suppose that's everything. Yet another week down. Unless you want to go over just briefly the elections in Moldova because those did happen.
Yeah, we could. I haven't followed it too closely. I'll be honest.
So
Most, mostly because I don't know how much change there will really be, no matter how aligned she might be with like, let's say, the West and Soros and company.
yeah, I heard that again there's not going to be like any expulsions of Russian troops or any like decoupling from Russia, but there will be a move towards the West, and we'll see how that plays out. But fundamentally, the election boiled down to on November 1st, they had the first round of elections where the incumbent president did win, and he was quite literally the coalition of parties that supported him were the Communist Party and the far right Nationalist Party. So quite literally Nazbol. Versus some
Yeah,
center right bureaucrat, and that's how it played out. The center right bureaucrats won the election, and it was by a it wasn't a landslide, but it was definitely a solid victory to say the least. Now, she of course campaigned on pro democracy and anti corruption values, and we saw how that turned out in Ukraine. That worked out swimmingly there, and you know I don't think she'll be very successful. Just to say, she is a color revolution president. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe Putin, maybe Putler will mobilize the Russians living in Transnistria, and we'll see that conflict flare up again. Or
yeah,
maybe we'll go in a completely unexpected direction, and maybe there'll be a reunification with Romania. That could be something. I don't see that happening. I think actually more Romanians are opposed to it just because of how dirt poor Moldova is at this point. But who knows? It just takes the right combination of leadership, the right public opinion for a reunification. And frankly, you know how I feel about statelets, and I wouldn't necessarily oppose a reunification between the two. Not that I live in either, but it would be interesting to see yet another significant Russian population in a European Union country if that did happen, because Romania would absorb all those Russians and Ukrainians in Transnistria, and that could be interesting. But fundamentally, I don't know how legitimate this election was. I don't know whether there was a little bit of a you know election rigging at play, as I'm sure we've all become familiar with. But I mean, if it can happen in the world's largest republic and the world's most preeminent power, then it can most definitely happen in a former Soviet republic. Now, I don't see this being as drastic as Ukraine because although I joke, I really don't see conflict flaring up in Moldova. I don't see that happening in the slightest. I don't see a lot of problems that would have plagued Ukraine happening in Moldova just because of the size and the real geopolitical insignificance compared to its neighbors, such as Romania, such as Ukraine, such as the Balkan countries, such as just probably the least significant country in Eastern Europe, barring maybe I don't know like Montenegro, but even Montenegro has seaports. Come on, like Moldova is a landlocked hunk of land that is sort of the bastard child between Romania and Russia, and can't really find its way to fit its way into either. Hasn't been part of either for the past 30 years, and I don't know. I think it's interesting culturally though, and as more of a symbolic thing showing the direction things are going. The fact that time and time again, no matter how many of these color revolutions fail, whether that be in Ukraine, whether it be in Belarus, whether it be in Georgia, that a lot of people are still willing to take that. And I do think it shows I don't know how I'd put it, but it shows that there needs to be a reevaluation among the current Soviet elite, so to speak, that they really reevaluate their strategies and realize why are we losing to these bureaucrats and these liberals and these center rightists and these Soros puppets at the end of the day.
Right. I mean, it isn't 2014 anymore. I don't see Russia being feeling as threatened. With I mean, those are good points. Like I would say, Russia, of course, has to look at why a lot of these governments are switching or aligning themselves with the EU. I mean, we all know. I mean, I'm sure. Let's say
Gibbs.
I'm sure Russia. Yeah, I'm sure Russia knows as well. Like, but I don't think they're the kind of threat that they used to present themselves. And funnily enough, what happened in Armenia is a very good example of a government that thought it was on the right path, that understood who was, the biggest bully on the block or the biggest power on the block. I'm not using that even in a pejorative way. Uh, and when worse came to worse, NATO wasn't there. In fact, there was a NATO member that was, basically destroying their country. So I think they understand that America, EU, NATO are not the supportive partners that they think they were 6 years ago. We're going to see a lot of that happening in Eastern Europe with regards to Hungary and Poland, because Biden is going to put incredible pressure on those countries, especially because now they are aligned. Trump actually made it difficult for NGOs to do their work in Poland and in Hungary. From what I've read, without Trump and without his support, a lot of that wouldn't have happened. So we would have seen Soros University go on, right? And I think what we're going to see, and Moldova won't be an exception, even though it's quite a remote country, and maybe less strategic for the West with regards to building antagonism towards Russia. But nonetheless, it's not going to get some enormous deals that are going to change the direction of the country. Its security isn't even going to be there. Um, so I think it's a very different world than it was 6 years ago. I think the West looks weaker. It doesn't look stronger. So even if you have, like, even if Moldova does form an incredibly strong partnership, but let's say it even joins NATO, it's kind of a moot point. It's not relevant because the pressure is all cultural, and that pressure is going to be exerted on them the way it's exerted on Eastern Europe.
Well, I do think probably one of the biggest points that Moldova is safe regardless of their new administration is that this summer Moldova did not have a Black Lives Matter protest.
That's going to change.
I hope all those euros are worth it. I really do.
Yeah, so I don't honestly, I don't think it's it's that much of a concern.
But I suppose with that out of the way, that actually gives a proper finish to this broadcast.
Hmm. Yeah, that's all I've got.
So thank you everyone for tuning into this little all over the place episode. There was a little quite a bit to cover, but we got through it as we do. So we'll see you guys next time. If we don't do another episode until after the Thanksgiving holiday for, of course, my American viewers, which I know is about, funny enough at this point, only like 36% of you. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you guys next time. And goodbye.
Take care.